Hi guys. Okay, so let's talk about Anderson's private government. We'll talk about part one first, then we'll talk about part two. So, part one is a very brief history of how egalitarians used to support free markets and what she calls market society. Um, Market society, the idea of a market society is a little bit vague, but the basic thought is that it's a type of society where goods and services are distributed primarily through markets, through people buying and selling and trading things, rather than through people providing those goods for themselves or collective ownership and management of those goods, or people gifting those goods to one another, or anything like that. So, why would egalitarians believe in a market society? Well, let's roll this back a little bit. We've already talked about some egalitarian moral theories. In a sense, all of the moral theories that we've considered so far in this class are egalitarian. Egalitarian just means believing in equality, and egalitarian is a person who believes in equality. So, what makes Anderson's sort of understanding of egalitarianism different is that she's talking about what we might call relational equality. So she thinks of equality in terms of getting rid of certain sorts of morally corrupting or pernicious or bad hierarchies between people. Hierarchies of authority, where one person is able to boss another person around. Hierarchies of esteem, where one person is sort of given more respect or dignity than another, and hierarchies of standing, where one person's interests, what they want, what they prefer, what they enjoy, counts more than what other people want or prefer or enjoy. Okay, so understanding egalitarianism in this sense, in this relational way, why would egalitarians support a market society? After all, you might think, well, usually when I hear about free markets in the news these days, I hear about disgustingly rich people accumulating more wealth than they could ever possibly need. Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or Michael Bloomberg or whoever. So these days we don't think about markets in we don't. If we believe in markets, we tend not to believe in them for egalitarian reasons. So let's go back into a period of time when people did believe in markets for egalitarian reasons. She gives a couple of examples in this excerpt from her book. One is from the Levelers in 17th century England, and one is from Thomas Paine, the sort of early U.S. and sort of late colonial theorist of American government and political economy. So for the Levelers, they supported free markets. They believed that there should be fewer restrictions on trade, fewer restrictions on who can go into what lines of work, where you can sell your labor, and they believed in this for egalitarian reasons. Well, why? Well, think about that particular historical context. They were working at a time when often corrupt guild monopolies controlled who could work in various sectors. If you wanted to be a woodworker or something, you'd have to be friends with somebody from the local woodworking guild and do some sort of, perhaps for a long period of time, unpaid apprenticeship, and then eventually you'd be allowed to do this. Rather than, you just get good at woodworking by yourself, or you study with somebody and then you go off on your own. So these guilds prevented people from entering into trades and selling their labor or their goods and services where they wanted to. The Church of England also placed very restrictive regulations on who could do business when and where. The king had at least a kind of nominal right to everybody's property. Your own ability to secure your property was sort of always under threat from the king. So this is a context in which restrictions on trade and restrictions on people's ability to work when and where they wanted to were some of the great sources of inequality at that time. And so the levelers thought, well, if we let people, do their own thing, get employed where they want to be employed, that will sell whatever they want to sell whenever they want to sell it, then this is going to, and let me add one more thing, hold on to their private property once they actually acquire it, rather than having their private property confiscated by the king or the state. Then this vision of a free market society was a more egalitarian vision than the society they lived in at the time. Okay, good. Cut to Thomas Paine, cut across the Atlantic Ocean. And Thomas Paine also is thinking of, also supports free markets, at least earlier in his career, is sort of more stridently supports free markets. Often because of, and this is sort of intimately tied into a kind of ideal of universal self-employment. So the thought was that, you don't want to work for somebody else for too long. If you work for somebody else for too long, that's must show something about your kind of lack of ambition or creativity or skill. But if we want to work towards a society where everybody works for themselves, and when everybody is working for themselves, they can meet each other in the marketplace as equals and buy and sell their goods. There was a sort of influential political philosophy at the time associated with the political philosopher John Locke, according to which private property came from a mixture of labor and natural resources. So, in the U.S. at the time, a land of, they're not thinking very hard about the indigenous people, but a land of abundant natural resources and people, European colonists willing to do labor on this land. Well, if you believe that this is the nature of private property, that if you turn the land into something useful through your own work, then you properly own that property, the value created by your labor, your action on the natural resources of the land. Okay, so guided by this Lockean theory of private property and an ideal of universal self-employment, the thought is that, if everybody meets everybody else kind of in the marketplace, we'll have a society of equals. We'll have a society where everyone is taken care of. There's an important caveat here, which is that, of course, the vast majority of people who are able to start their own businesses or even do wage labor for other people are white guys. So, women and people of color are sort of conveniently excluded from this picture. Setting that aside for a moment, there's this kind of ideal of a society where everybody's working for themselves, and we get what we want from one another by sort of respecting each other's ability to do whatever you want to do with your life and meeting each other in the marketplace for the goods and services that we can't provide for ourselves. Okay, so this ideal of a society of self-employed people is a kind of egalitarian ideal in this relational sense that Anderson is concerned with. It's a society that's not based on hierarchy. Everybody meets everybody else in the marketplace as equals. Okay. There are a lot of reasons why this, why the kind of egalitarian argument for free markets sort of fell apart after the 18th century and the early 19th century when this stuff was being written. But the main part of the story, at least according to Anderson, is the Industrial Revolution. So in the Industrial Revolution, where giant factories are springing up in the cities, and we're all of a sudden able to produce just enormous quantities of goods through economies of scale, through having a single corporation own really significant means of production, have a single factory owner own the equipment necessary to produce tons and tons of garments or shoes or whatever, bread, I don't know, whatever they were making in factories in those days. Okay, so the thought is that with the Industrial Revolution comes economies of scale, and comes a situation where you cannot be your own personal self-employed factory worker. That's not how factories work. Factories require large numbers of people working together, and the way that things were turning out in the Industrial Revolution, those factories would be owned by owners, and they would be worked by workers. And so there's a separate group of people, the group of owners, who dictate the terms of how the factory operates, and then there's the workers who actually do the work. Okay, so this is sort of the natural tendency that markets go in, is towards these kinds of economies of scale. And in a sense, that's a good thing. We're able to produce all of these goods and services, which we were really, really labor intensive to produce in the past. But of course, the harm that's come with this is that factory owners, for example, are able to abuse their employees in ways that you would just have never seen in the past. So, you see factories in England where there are a bunch of 10-year-olds working 16 hours a day in disgusting, dangerous conditions. That hadn't existed in that sort of ways in any time previously in human history. So, to sum up, there was Anderson is an egalitarian, where she understands egalitarianism in terms of working against types of morally corrupting hierarchy. The early supporters of free markets believed in free markets for egalitarian reasons, but as the sort of nature of the markets involved changed, due in large part to the Industrial Revolution, the egalitarian rationale for market society disappeared. And yet, we have market society anyway. So, Anderson says, this should make us a little suspicious. If you have a practice with some original justification, and that justification disappears, but the practice sticks around, that is one good reason to think that the practice no longer makes sense. Okay, I'll stop there. I'll do part 2 in another video.